Good evening. In the blessing of God's loving grace, welcome to Canadian Mennonite University Face2Face, mostly through online connection. My name is Cheryl Pauls, and I serve as CMU president. CMU is a university in the Anabaptist faith tradition and is honored to live and learn on the ancestral lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, and Métis nations. We are grateful for their stewardship of land and water and for their hospitality. These gifts enable us to live, learn, work, rest, play, and serve God, the Creator, in this place. As we receive these gifts, we commit ourselves to honor the Treaty 1 Covenant of 1871, as signed by First Nation peoples and immigrant settler peoples. We repent the truth of past harms and ongoing wrongs and seek reconciliation with Indigenous nations. This is a pandemic time, a time to attend to safety, health, and well-being, a time to attend to what we're noticing, yearning for, and wondering about the virus, yes, and maybe more, about how the conditions of life are changing and how we are being changed. This evening's face-to-face conversation is called Seeing Through the Pandemic, the Art of Noticing. CMU's face-to-face series engages complex topics, not from a posture of sides, back and front, or left and right, but from a range of vantage points of discipline, vocation, and experience. I trust the art of noticing from where you sit and who you are will be awakened this evening. A few comments on format. Our vision for this series has always included face-to-face here in Marpeck Commons, and also face-to-face on the road, on air, and online. For pandemic reasons, we're almost entirely online this evening, and for that reason, we have decided that panelists will remove their masks when speaking. Please note that there are fewer than 15 other people in this very large space, and they are more than 10 meters from the stage wearing masks, as we do in all CMU indoor classes and shared spaces. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Kenton Loby, CMU faculty member in International Development and Environmental Studies. Kenton will host the evening and introduce the panelists. I trust we will learn and notice much together. Thank you. Kenton, please.
Good evening. Welcome here. I'm really pleased that there are people to look at here. And while you are at a distance, it still makes a big difference for those of us that are in this big room. For those of you that are online, it's also good to have you here with us in the many places that you may find yourselves. We trust you'll enjoy this evening. We live in strange times right now, and strange is this kind of ubiquitous word that gets thrown around, as you may have noticed with other words that may surface tonight or maybe not. They are precarious. We're aware of vulnerability. Uncertainty seems to abound as we try and imagine a time frame more than a few weeks or a month ahead. We're aware of the adaptation that needs to be taking place. The call that I've been making all summer since this began is adapt, adapt, adapt. This is what's getting me through the pandemic. The origin story for this evening comes from the carrot patch, strangely enough. I spend the winters teaching here at CMU and the summers teaching just south, or the summers farming just south of Winnipeg. And I was seeding carrots when John Dewick called and asked whether I would entertain the idea of hosting a class online with 6 colleagues during a pandemic and the farming season. It may say a lot about the pandemic that I said, yeah, sure, John, let's do it. And I was really glad to be joined in that by 6 colleagues, some of whom are with me this evening. Co-teaching is a wonderful task, and to do it in the summer was a real way of developing a kind of co-immunity, of being together with good friends and colleagues here at CMU. The grouping was interdisciplinary by design, and what I mean by that is we had scientists, we had social scientists, and we had humanities scholars all together by design because we wanted to see what happened across those different ways of knowing. We asked the question as we began and prepared to plan for the class, how we would begin to look around and reflect on what we are noticing from our particular vantage points and the disciplines that we inhabit here at CMU. For me, it's a real treat. As you heard from Cheryl, I teach in our interdisciplinary platforms, international development, environmental studies. Each of these is already very versed in what that kind of different way of knowing affords. Tonight's title, Seeing Through the Pandemic, is not meant to be a kind of conspiracy theory, like it's some kind of hoax. The title comes from a couple of books that I'm using to teach this fall, thankfully. The first from David Waltner Taves, who published his book on pandemics with an introduction written in May during lockdown. Amongst other things, you'll hear some from Rachel, I think, tonight. There was an encouragement for the biomedical sciences to pull back from their narrow focus and to use what he talked about as peripheral vision. He urged us to think about one another as each other's peripheral vision. The second text that was helpful for me in thinking here and got to the language of noticing was an anthropologist named Anna Lowenhaupt-Singh, whose book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, is a kind of ethnography of the Matsutake mushroom. And she begins her book with the following words: "What do you do when your world falls apart?" I go on a walk, and I hope I find mushrooms. Mushrooms, of course, don't appear where you always expect them to, and in her book, they appear in degraded landscapes of heavily logged forests. And that's the setting for her book. But it was this idea of noticing in a particular moment in time that not only drove this course, but also drove me into grocery stores and my interest in food systems and see what is happening with consumers as they think about the kinds of precarious times. What happens as they think about 2 weeks of food in their basement? What does that look like? My curiosity was roused. So this evening, I want to invite into conversation 4 of my colleagues, the folks who said yes in the midst of the pandemic and the summer to co-teaching online with me. I'm most grateful that they're here. We're going to try and have a bit of a conversation. We're going to welcome folks here in person to come to the mics that are close to you when we get to that point. And we've got a forum for questions online that are at the bottom of the web page. There's a form you can fill in, and I'll receive those here, and I'll be able to ask those if you direct them to particular individuals or if you leave them open. I'll say more about this when we get there. The first 45 minutes of our evening we'll be hearing from faculty, and I'll introduce them in just a minute. And that time of hearing from faculty will be followed then by a time of conversation and dialogue. So, introducing. Leanne Dowsett, here on my right, is going to lead us off. She's teaching music therapy here at CMU, though I share other great overlaps and interests in that she's also a teacher practitioner. She spends half of her time here teaching music therapy and is also a counselor and music therapist. I noticed about Leanne when she was teaching that she was able to bring those practices from her own work into the classroom as we sat quietly, attending to our breath, to music, to begin to create a space to talk about anxiety and collective trauma. Leanne, it's good to have you here. Rod Raynar is teaching sociology here. He also has a practice of his own, which is hosting an intentional community of students at Emmaus House. Rod is a hospitable fellow. I noticed during the course his energy for student dialogue when he would yell out to Katrina or to Danica, "Go for it!" as he opened up the space for conversation. It's of course the first time I had to teach with many of these colleagues, and so these were new things for me to see. Rachel Krause on my left here is teaching biology and ecology here at CMU. One of the many things I love about Rachel is that in talking with her just before this evening, she said, "I spent most of the day in the forest, actually in the marsh, in the forest, in hip waders with students." That's the kind of science that we're talking about this evening in terms of complexity and noticing. Rachel, it's great to have you here. Chris Hubner teaches in philosophy and theology here at CMU, and he may now be wondering what exactly it is that I'm going to say about him. I've known Chris for a long time. I'm forever indebted to Chris, actually, for putting good books on my desk. It's the same thing he does for students. Anna Tsing, who I mentioned earlier, is a book that was on my desk because of Chris. In addition to his love for good books, he loves spirited conversation, and he is known for that here. You're in for a good time tonight, everyone, and I'm going to invite Leanne to start us off. We'll continue unintroduced from here, and once we finish with Chris, I'll come back up, and we'll begin some time for conversation. Leanne, please.
Thank you, Kenton, for that lovely introduction, and good evening, everyone. It's nice to see your faces, and hello to those of you online as well. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is trauma and why this pandemic is a traumatic experience. I'm going to talk a little bit about how trauma impacts our brain, and then a bit about how we can use music to help in the face of trauma, which is the area that I work in my clinical practice. So what is trauma? It happens when our brain and body systems become overwhelmed in the face of a life-threatening event. So when this happens, we're not able to maintain a sense of control over our experiences. We're not able to stay connected with the people we care about, or the people around us. We have trouble making meaning out of what's happening because we're so flooded. So experiencing a trauma, you feel a sense of helplessness and being out of control. Many different types of things can cause trauma. It could be a life-threatening event, like a car accident or a natural disaster. It could be an instance of interpersonal violence or an ongoing lived experience of systemic racism and oppression. But tonight we're thinking about the pandemic and what is traumatic about the pandemic experience. Well, COVID-19 is literally a threat to our lives and the lives of people around us. We saw it coming across the world from China. We knew it was coming here, and we knew that here, people in Canada, people in our city were dying because of COVID-19. It's an invisible threat, so we can't see it, but it's around us. And especially at the beginning, we didn't really know how it worked or how to best keep ourselves safe in the face of this. We've had some mixed messages over time. We don't need to wear masks. We do need to wear masks. It's not safe to go to school. It is now safe to go to school with precautions. And this leaves us second-guessing ourselves and our choices. It's confusing. We have all experienced losses related to the pandemic. We've missed out on important events like graduations, weddings, and so much time that we would have normally spent with our friends and our family. Healthy relationships are the #1 best way to mitigate the impact of trauma, and our relationships have been so affected during this time. We've been disconnected physically from our loved ones. There's been huge economic impacts because of the pandemic, and we know when financial stress goes up, substance abuse goes up, and domestic violence goes up, adding new layers of trauma to this experience for some people. Not being able to follow health protocols can be especially traumatizing, and feeling let down by the systems that are meant to protect us. I heard a podcast by someone who is incarcerated, and they didn't have access to soap in their prison. And imagine how traumatizing that would be to not be able to keep yourself safe and do the things you know can protect you. So I'll talk a bit about how the brain works and how it processes trauma or not. So I want to point out 3 different parts of the brain that we're thinking about with trauma. The brainstem is our oldest part of the brain, way down at the bottom. It controls our survival instincts and the automatic processes that happen in our body, like our heart rate. Our midbrain, our limbic system, is the emotion center in our brain, and it processes sensory information like touch and sound and sight. And then our cortex is the front part of our brain. That's the computer part of our brain that makes decisions, is able to integrate information, to plan, and to store memories. So when things are going well in life, when we're not in front of a microphone, when we're calm and collected, we use that front part of our brain to make rational decisions. But when we're in a traumatic experience, that part of our brain goes offline, and we start reacting from our brainstem. So we shift from that rational, responsive reaction to a reactive reaction. Our stress hormones go through the roof, and we might flip into fight or flight mode. You've heard those words, or maybe even freeze. Whatever our brainstem decides is going to best help us survive, that's what our body does. So once the immediate threat has passed, most people are able to resume normal brain functioning, but others can develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress or easily flip back into that lower brain level of functioning. So some symptoms of post-traumatic stress could be intrusive memories or thoughts, high levels of emotional distress, such as anxiety. I just read a study tonight saying anxiety is up 56% right now in Canada, so huge. Hypervigilance, sorry about that. Being on edge, being jumpy, having difficulty concentrating or remembering things, avoiding thinking about the incident, maybe scrolling through your phone all the time or using substances to avoid thinking about things that are bothering you, and a pervasive negative mood, maybe depression, maybe social detachment. Maybe early on in the pandemic, you were making lots of Zoom calls with your friends, and now you're just tired of it and you're detached. All of us, I'm sure, have experienced some of these symptoms over the last 6 months, but if these symptoms get severe and interfere with your daily functioning, you're starting to move into the area of post-traumatic stress disorder. So, as a music therapist, what I think about and what I've been thinking about during this pandemic time is how we can use music to work directly on the brain to support people going through these traumatic experiences, which we all are. So if I said to you, just calm down, just calm yourself down. I'm speaking to this part of your brain, that frontal cortex. And that doesn't work, as you know. If we're experiencing trauma or we're reliving trauma, we're operating from the brainstem. And the best way to connect with someone's brainstem is through our senses, and particularly through rhythm, through sounds, through movement, and through sensory input. So perfect if you're a music therapist. I know exactly what you might need. So for you, it might be listening to music with a slow, steady beat that gets you back online. Listening to music can ground us in the present moment, get us out of the spinning, busy thoughts in our heads and back into our bodies. Our brains are wired to connect and entrain to rhythm, and we can use that way our brain's wired to calm us down, to get our nervous system back online. For other people, it might be walking in nature that helps them regulate. Again, that repetitive rhythmic movement is what tells us it's going to be okay, we're safe. Other people might connect to art. I might encourage someone to squeeze clay between their hands or to move paint on paper. Again, it's not about making a painting about your emotional experience. It's about that repetitive rhythmic movement. That's what tells your nervous system things are going to be okay. Music's an emotional experience, so it works if we get that brainstem back online. We can connect with the limbic system. Music allows us to connect or reconnect with our feelings and find ways to express those feelings. Also, music activates the reward center in our brain, which can reduce those feelings we talked about, anger, guilt, fear, and anxiety that are so common right now, and boost positive feelings like connection, confidence, and joy. Another important aspect of music is that it's a shared experience. It can really help create community and reduce isolation. So many of us find singing with others a therapeutic experience, and we are so missing the opportunity to do that right now. But at the same time, while we've lost some opportunities, we've created new music spaces and opportunities online, such as live stream concerts and virtual choirs. Humans are resilient and creative beings, and we're finding ways to adapt and overcome challenges in the face of this pandemic. So music is a resilience-enhancing activity, and while we've been physically distanced and disconnected during this pandemic, music offers a path for people to stay grounded, to take care of themselves, and to reconnect with others.
That feels good. Everywhere we turn now, we hear the word pandemic. Unless you're someone who has closed your blinds, turned off the radio, the TV, turned off your computer, you know this reality. Across the globe, billions of people are being drawn into a battle with something so small, a virus. And yet this tiny little thing is fundamentally reshaping the contours of our existence. The changes that we are witnessing are unlike anything that we have experienced. My mother, who is now in her 80s, shakes her head when she speaks of the pandemic. An extroverted woman, somebody who loves to be out with her friends, to be interacting, all of a sudden is forced to stay in her own apartment for months. She feels it. Her world, my world, your world, our world is being radically altered. As reflected in the composition of this panel, the pandemic poses a cascade of questions for the environmentalist, the musician, the psychologist, the biologist, the philosopher, and the list goes on. And there's no need for me to don my sociologist hat, really, for me to sense the profound social upheaval or dislocation that has existed in even my own social realm. In our desire to fight the spread of COVID, we have been forced to accept fundamental changes in how we interact with each other. Words like social distancing, bubbles, flattening the curve, social isolation, quarantine, and others have been almost violently inserted into our daily lives. Previously, these words only sporadically were noted in conversation, if ever. But today, these words are impossible to escape. It's just not words that have been forcefully inserted into our lives, but technology too. The online platform, Zoom, exists now for many of us at the center of our lives. As someone who teaches here at CMU, I have been forced to accept Zoom. I must admit, however, that I have not gladly accepted its presence. As a teacher, but even more so as a human being, I yearn to be in the proximity of others. As a teacher, I refuse to believe that what happens in the classroom where teacher and student can directly engage in discussion with each other can be replicated through the use of Zoom. Zoom fatigue is a real thing. I feel it. Many of you feel it. We have come to accept the need to separate ourselves from people that we care, from many of the people that we once shared life with so closely, from the people that helped give shape and meaning to our lives. Grandparents' hearts ache in the absence of being able to physically be present in the lives of their grandchildren. Children yearn to be with their friends, to have their lives structured by the certainty of school, sports, and play. And across the country and in many, many other countries, countless seniors live almost barricaded beyond the comfort of their loved ones who so desperately want to reach out to them. Too many people have died without the presence and comfort of the people they love. COVID has struck deeply into the heart of who we are and how we make sense of life. It was with a deep sense of sadness that I listened to Prime Minister Trudeau yesterday. And when he indicated that we needed to accept that this year's Thanksgiving will be different. In our household, it's customary for 30 people to join around the table. There's always enough good food, laughter, and sharing to go around. This year, I'm uncertain what form our Thanksgiving will take. And I must admit, that makes me feel sad. I do know, however, that there's much to be thankful for. Good colleagues to be with, family members to be with, students to teach, and these realities I do not want to forget. In the midst of the social upheaval that we've experienced, this summer's class provided us with an incredibly rich and rare opportunity for a group of 7 academics representing 7 different academic disciplines to come together to think, to read, and to discuss the implications of the pandemic, but also alongside an incredibly bright and engaged group of students. Yes, COVID has resulted in the upheaval of our social existence. At the same time, I believe that COVID represents an opportunity for us to think how we want to live in relationship to the other. Whether it be in relation to friends, family, co-workers, or more generally, the type of society that we envision we want to live in. All of this to say, the pandemic provided us with a unique opportunity for reflection, a pause, if you will. In the midst of all of the bad news we were receiving, we were challenged to see an opportunity to gather together to, as I think Terry Schellenberg stated, to search for insights that go beyond daily infection and death rates. In the midst of calamity, lessons can be learned, powerful lessons. The question is, however, whether we are willing to courageously and truthfully read that which is happening around us. Humans are born storytellers. It is through stories that we make sense of ourselves, our place in the world, our history, and our aspirations for the future. Based on our stories, we act in the world we create. It is easy to focus on the difficulties associated with the pandemic. The challenge is to imaginatively use the pandemic to bring about change in a way that will benefit us. Among the many events that occurred this year, I've been repeatedly drawn back to the image of very elderly seniors peering out of windows, looking for any sign of a loved one. And largely unseen were the dynamics occurring inside the halls of those care homes where the staff were often too few and those who were there overworked. In the halls of those care homes, COVID took its hold, and as a result, far too many elderly people died. Now, we know that eventually there's going to be a review of what went on in that circumstance and others. In the context of this summer's class, however, we dared to ask whether the solution to this social issue is simply the influx of more money. Money directed toward paying workers better, money to address the overcrowding of rooms. And yes, more money is likely part of the answer, but as we talked, we discussed whether more fundamental changes are required. For the majority of human history, families lived together intergenerationally. Households where seniors continued to interact with and contribute to the well-being of their loved ones was the norm. The question is, however, are we willing to radically re-envision the way that we live? Perhaps the pandemic is telling us something. Over the duration of the course, our gaze was also drawn beyond the issues facing Canadians. We also peered into the broader social, economic story that is increasingly catching the attention of people across the globe. We talked about how we've created globalized networks because they would make us more efficient, productive, and our lives more convenient. Yeah, we can fly around the world. Our supermarkets are full with produce and fruit grown in far-off countries. We've created global markets, telecommunications systems, the internet, and promoted the belief that everything that is faster is better. But pandemics are not just a biological phenomena. They are a geopolitical, financial, atmospheric, and the list goes on, phenomena also. Perhaps we should view the pandemic as a not so subtle indication that we need to begin to rewrite the script of our global story. Beyond the pandemic, we need to remember that we face other pressing issues. For example, we should not forget that just a few short months ago, significant attention was being directed towards the issue of climate change. Think for a moment. In the midst of the pandemic, much of this tension has been diverted, and for understandable reasons. This issue and its implications are not going away, though. We cannot allow ourselves to forget that the pandemic is a story about more than a virus. At its heart, we are reading a story of a world increasingly committed to what are arguably, I would say, unsustainable ways of living. For 3 short weeks this summer, 7 profs and a group of students joined together. We were drawn into different discussions, difficult discussions, but also hopeful ones. We were challenged to creatively engage with each other as we sought to envision ways of engaging with the world and with each other in ways that will allow us to flourish. Yes, this is undoubtedly a difficult time to live through. All that is occurring is not disruptive. It is not all just negative. And having our social life so profoundly disrupted, my hope is that we will have recognized the importance of face-to-face interactions. We fundamentally need each other. I need you, and you need me. We need to be able to touch each other, to give and receive hugs freely, to be able to see each other's faces, to laugh, to talk, and eat with each other in life-giving ways. It's my belief that the pandemic happened for reasons intimately intertwined with the stories that we believe to be true. My hope is also that we have the courage to rewrite those stories, stories that are drawing us into treacherous ground, whether that be ecologically, personally, or communally. The pandemic, I think, presents this opportunity. I hope we listen.
Good to be with you all. Kenton talked a little bit about the writing of David Weltner Taves, and in our course, right near the beginning, we had the great blessing of having him join us and talk about his work and talk about his perspective as someone who researches diseases that we get from animals, zoonotic diseases, those diseases that can become pandemics. And he wrote that he's written many books, but in the book that Kenton already introduced to us on pandemics, in that first chapter that he wrote in May, he said, the pandemic, is not a battle to win. The best we can hope for is an uneasy, mutually respectful, naturally wary conversation. So I want to reframe a couple of things. If we're going to see through, if we're going to see in new ways, if we're going to notice through new things, maybe we need to reframe some of the ways that we understand what we know. So I'm a biologist. I'm actually a disease ecologist. I don't study viruses, though. They are a unique, interesting, foreign thing to me. But as a biologist, I want to talk a bit about science. And then I want to talk specifically a bit about ecology, which is an area of science that I spend a lot of my time reading and teaching and researching in. So I have to say, I'm pleased that the scientific process is in the public eye right now. We're interested in it. We're curious about it. We think that it's important. I think we always kind of have this idea that science somehow is important, but we're all eager right now to know what the scientists are finding out, right? We hear about it every day on the news, and we talk about it with our friends. And I'm really heartened that people seem to be interested in understanding it better. But science can be confusing. Leanne said this, right? It's confusing. Right now, it's confusing. And I think partly that's because sometimes we confuse science for something that it's not. So I think what we wish for is science to be this set of weapons that we can fight this battle with. This battle that Walter Taves has already told us isn't a battle at all, right? And it turns out science isn't a set of weapons either. Science is a way of knowing about the world. It's a systematic way that we chip away at the truth, that we chip away trying to figure out what's true. It's kind of like, you know, when you watch on TV and someone goes into this really dark room and they've got a tiny little flashlight, and I always think, just turn the light on. But they've got this little flashlight, and they're looking around the room, they're shining it around, trying to figure out what's going on. That's what science is like. So imagine that COVID is like that dark room, and scientists are in there shining their little flashlights around and trying to understand what all is in there, what all is going on. And sometimes they'll be shining their flashlight and they'll think they figured out the outlines of something. But then maybe another scientist comes along with their little flashlight and they further illuminate it. And together, maybe they get a slightly different answer than that first scientist originally thought was true. Right? Maybe scientists change their minds. And in fact, that's what we've found. That's partly why it's so confusing, because that's how science works. We build on those little corners of knowledge that our colleagues have uncovered for us. Right? So science is a way of knowing. Let's talk a little bit about ecology. So ecology is a discipline within biology that's interested in relationships between organisms, organisms of the same kind or different kinds in their environment. Now, also in that chapter that Kenton and I have been talking about, Walter Taves he describes the emergence of this pandemic as predictable. Based on how we live with the rest of nature, we might say it's inevitable, but kind of in the way that an earthquake is in a zone of tectonic activity. We know it's possible. We know the big one's coming. We just don't know what or when. Right, so ecology tells us about relationships. And the pandemic has shown us our relationships with nature. right? It's shown us how very connected we are to the rest of the species that we share the planet with. Remember, pandemics come from zoonotic diseases, zoo meaning animal. Zoonotic diseases, diseases we get from animals. That's partly why they get out of control, because they're brand new to us, that our bodies, that our immune systems don't know what to do with them. And sometimes they get lucky and they hit on something that our immune systems aren't ready for. Right? So they're diseases that have jumped the species barrier and found a new home in us. In other words, pandemics are ecological phenomena. They're an inevitable result of us living in a world with other species. And so I think the interesting thing here is that pandemics can force us to rethink our definitions of health, right? Our relationship with nature. And when we do this, it also can help change how we frame the problem. It's biomedical, right? If we get sick, we want there to be a cure. We would like there to be a vaccine. But it's so much more than biomedical, right? Because if we think that the problem is just biomedical, something a cure, then we're kind of too late. It's ecological. All right, so let's close with a little bit more from Walter Taves, because he has a lot of wisdom for us. He tells us that all species on the planet, ours included, are members of one dysfunctional extended family. And we really need to learn to live together. And perhaps that's one of the lessons, Rod, that this pandemic can also reveal to us.
Forget the mushroom at the end of the world. It's the mushroom growing at the end of Chris's face right now. Okay, well, now for something just a little bit different. Humans are storytelling animals or something to that effect. I think Rod told us, well, here's a story. In the early part of the 16th century, a new viral mutation showed up in the Netherlands. It followed the traditional westward movement of the plagues that is arriving from the east, although not as far east as Asia, where the great medieval plagues and some relatively, comparatively minor contemporary ones originated. This particular virus entered the country from the German city of Emden, just across the border. It was a nasty virus that hit the epidemiological sweet spot characteristic of the most deadly contagions. It spread easily, it was resilient, and it caused significant and lasting damage. So people quickly became concerned that this virus might just threaten the entire population. Some even worried that the very existence of humankind, or indeed all of creation, was at stake. It was, in other words, a public health crisis of the most alarming sort. And so a state of emergency was quickly declared. Government officials leapt into action, like government officials do, issuing decrees to demonstrate that they had the situation under control, and announcing stringent measures and new mechanisms designed to contain the transmission of the virus in the hopes of eventually eliminating it altogether. Now, because the spread of this virus was hastened by travel, borders were tightened and restrictions were put in place to prevent it from moving between one community and the next. In one of his decrees, the king who ruled over the Netherlands at this time declared that special attention must be paid to those who would change their place of abode, since they might infect unsuspecting residents in the new cities to which they moved. Those are his words. In order to guard against this, he continued, and I'll quote again, "We will ordain and decree that none of the inhabitants of our aforesaid Netherlands, of whatever state, quality, or condition he may be, shall be admitted or received into any city or village unless he brings with him a certificate from the place where he last resided." It all sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? Only the virus I have been describing wasn't a biological pathogen so much as a theological heresy. The official who was charged with the task of certifying that any would-be travelers were virus-free was the local town priest. As with COVID-19, the experts put their heads together and devised a new name to identify this virus. And this is basically how the term Anabaptism entered into our lexicon. Sometimes heresy was referred to as a poisonous weed, but it was more commonly depicted as an infection or contagion of some sort. For example, in the early days of this particular development, one historian notes that the bailiff of Kenmerland, I have no idea where that is, refused to enter the town of Monnikendam because it was too infected with this heresy. Now, just as with biological viruses, some strains of heresy prove to be more deadly than others. And Anabaptism was considered to be far and away the most deadly of the many heresies that were circulating through the Netherlands at this time. You might say that Anabaptism was the theological equivalent of Ebola. You don't want to let this particular heretical infection gain any sort of traction whatsoever, because if you do, it's pretty much game over. So what do you do with those who are discovered to be infected with Anabaptism? Well, theological and juridical leaders of the time agreed that they must be executed. Here's how the King Philip II put it in the decree I quoted from earlier. Men are to be executed with the sword, and women buried alive. That is, if they will not maintain or persist in their errors. But if they do persist in their errors, opinions or heresies, well, then they are to be executed with fire. Now, I suspect it's hard for many of us to appreciate the severity with which heresy in general is viewed in this context. And it's probably even more difficult for us to imagine that someone would be willing to kill a person who has been deemed to be a heretic, let alone see it as their duty to do so. But it's important to try and appreciate why the so-called heresy of Anabaptism was viewed as such a dangerous threat. And noticing how it was depicted as an infection, I think, can help us appreciate the context here. But let me provide another example. One significant reason for the harsh measures against Anabaptism had to do with the very question of believers' baptism that was at the heart of the whole thing. Medieval Christians typically assumed that all children were born in a state of possession by the devil. And so the practice of infant baptism was conceived as a sort of exorcism that was thought to keep the power of the devil at bay. But this is, of course, what Anabaptists renounced. The German Catholic theologian Johann Fabry summarized the situation this way. He said, the refusal to baptize infants was the equivalent of sacrificing children to the devil. And following this line of thought, Catholic polemicists throughout this time routinely made connections between Anabaptists and witches and referred to both of them as the devil's minions. So it's easy to see how believers' baptism came to be identified as the kind of the chief symptom of this Anabaptist virus. But it wasn't the only one. One can imagine kids showing up at school in these days and having to run through a sort of pre-screening checklist. Did you receive the Eucharist this Sunday? Have you been to confession in the last 14 days? Did you pray to the saints to intercede on behalf of your dearly departed but nevertheless catty aunt who remains stuck in purgatory? Have you kissed the relic of St. Barbara's severed foot recently? Do you believe that Jesus received his flesh from Mary? And so on. If you answer no to any two or more of the above questions, you must not attend school, but should instead head straight to the Inquisitor's office to get yourself tested. You might be infected with Anabaptism. So it's pretty clear that this Anabaptist virus was thought to be a very, very bad thing. It was even worse than crimes like murder, theft, sexual assault. And this is captured in one of the most dramatic, it was one of the favorite stories of mine in The Martyr's Mere, favorite in a funny sort of way. There was an Anabaptist named Hendrik Arendts in a town of Briel. It was a fishing village in the province of South Holland. He was a carpenter. And because it was a fishing village, he was in the shipyard working on ships, and another new ship came into the port that needed some work. Boards had been damaged or something, and it was leaking. So Hendrik was asked if he would do some work on this ship, and of course he readily agreed. But unbeknownst to him, it was a ship that was operated by pirates. So he's working to fix a pirate ship. Now the town authorities clued into the fact that they had pirates in the community, which wasn't a very happy thing, and so they sent some police, I guess, and raided the ship. Took everybody in, including our Mennonite friend, Hendrik. Because you don't want pirates in your community, they tried to ship them off to Delft, a few kilometers down the road, and have them imprisoned there. Delft city officials said no way, and so they ended up in Rotterdam. And then they went to trial. And the pirates and Hendrik were all sentenced to be hanged for treason, which is the appropriate punishment that you receive if you're convicted of treason. At which point Hendrik said, "Excuse me, Judge, I would like to raise an objection. I'm not a pirate, right? I haven't committed a crime. I've never murdered anybody. I've never stolen anything. I've always treated women with respect. And if you will just examine me, you will see this for yourself." And so the judge, to his credit, said, "Okay, let's examine you," and he did, and he discovered that as he talked to him, that Hendrik wasn't in fact a pirate. It was even worse. He was an Anabaptist. And so he simply changed Hendrik's sentence to heresy, and when the pirates were hanged, Hendrik was burned at the stake. Now, I don't know what you all did in the early days of the pandemic when we found ourselves in a rather sudden period of extended lockdown. Some were baking sourdough bread, and everyone, it seems, watched The Tiger King at one point, and yes, I did too. But one of the other things I did, my pandemic project, so to speak, was I sat down and finally took the chance to read through The Martyr's Mirror. And I also kept track of what I read on a spreadsheet in order to track some of the details and to help identify trends and patterns that I thought were interesting. Now, at first, it was simply something to do with some of the extra time I had on my hands during lockdown. And it probably also served as a convenient distraction from other more pressing matters like where am I going to find toilet paper? Or how is my daughter going to get home from Guatemala? But somehow in the process of reading, I discovered some new patterns that emerged, right? And I've already alluded to this. I was immediately struck by the significant number of pandemic references that were just littered throughout the text. The rhetoric of contagion it shows up on almost every page. And the book is full of images that we now associate with life lived in the midst of a pandemic. These patterns are so prominent that I'm inclined to describe The Martyr's Mirror as a kind of pandemic text. If you're one of those people like me who has created a pandemic reading list, well, yes, you should read Boccaccio's Decameron, and you should probably read Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, but you should also consider reading The Martyr's Mirror. You'll be amazed at what jumps out at you when you read it in the current context. Here are a few more things. Torture. Torture is a version of contact tracing, right? The torture is there to elicit questions like, by whom were you baptized? Where? In whose house? Who else was present, right? Give us names so that we can track down others who have the virus. Rachel and Kenton promised me that they were going to mention something about microbial refugees, and they've let me down, but it's coming. There's a sense of microbial refugees here, right? I mean, one of the things that becomes clear is that these Anabaptists were particularly nomadic people. They moved around, in fact, far more than their contemporaries. And one of the patterns is that they were typically executed in places that were not where they were from, right? A lot of movement. The crumbling of the family. right? Pandemics are hard on families, and so Anabaptism is also hard on families, or at least the biological family. There's a constant tension that runs through the text between the biological and the Christian family. And then there is the singing. Just like COVID-19, the virus of Anabaptism was spread particularly through singing in the early times, right? Anabaptist martyrology started out as songs that were sung. They didn't produce books until much, much later. Interesting. And finally, we need to remember that this particular virus was never eradicated, right? So we're going to have to learn how to live with it. Maybe that's what ecumenism is, or certain forms of religious toleration. We're here at Canadian Mennonite University. We are the virus. Let that sink in for a minute. Now, my approach here is a little different than the others, right? Instead of looking at this pandemic through a disciplinary lens, I've started with the pandemic and looked back at other texts, and it's amazing what the pandemic lays bare. I started reading The Martyr's Mirror to kill time, to knock off an academic task that I'd been putting off for some time. So if the pandemic gave me time to read The Martyr's Mirror, what I found was that it actually helped me understand many of the dynamics that animate the text itself. So what does our experience of living through a pandemic open up for us? In some ways, it opens us up to the past. Thanks.
It's like deja vu. Danica, Katrina are here. We've got folks gathered. It's good. We have questions online, an option for folks who are observing this online on CMU's website to fill in the form at the bottom right corner of that page. The same page where you're watching the YouTube link. There is a fillable form in there, and that gets sent in to folks at the back of the room here, and they'll forward it to me. One of the folks that didn't come tonight is Joe Arnold, who looked at big data in a time of increased online presence. And anyway, as I watch and pay attention to the way in which we're connecting, I'm aware. I'd like to open up this time for questions too of those that are gathered here. I'm really pleased that there are students here, and you are our work, and I'm interested to offer the floor to you first, those of you upstairs and those of you down here on the floor. What did you hear tonight? What struck you? What was new? What questions of clarification? I see someone either running to the bathroom or getting to the mic.
In this case, it is the mic, Kenton.
Thanks, Isaac.
This is Isaac Schlegel. I'm an undergrad student in my 5th year. And I have a question for Rachel, especially. Rachel, you were talking about this, some of the traps we get into when we're approaching the pandemic with sort of this combative metaphor understanding of science and its function. And I was curious for us if you could point to some examples of places over the past few months you've seen that sort of language or mindset being used and misleading people, whether it's in government policy level decisions or in other sort of organizational settings. Thanks.
I just want to confirm that I understood your question. Where have I seen that battle language? Is that what you meant?
Where have you seen that sort of having sort of practical impacts on people's approach to responding to the pandemic? So where have, this language of, we're looking for weapons to use, almost, like this style of treatment.
Yeah.
How have you seen that sort of impacting the approaches people have been taking to whether it's mitigating risk or whatever policies that are being rolled out? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Okay. I actually think maybe that's a better one for Leanne and Rod, but I'll take a crack first.
For sure.
I think I am curious actually to hear what Leanne has to say about that. But I think the problem with that language is that it leads us to the wrong conclusions. It suggests to us that we find that biomedical fix, right? We get this vaccine. I don't know if you have had these like dystopic sci-fi moments in your own life, but sometimes I find myself saying, well, when we have a vaccine, we will blah, blah, blah. And I feel like I'm in some kind of dystopic novel or something. I think that's the wrong way to think about it, because this is not the first pandemic we've had. We had, maybe those of you in this room remember bird flu or swine flu. I think we've all heard about Ebola. Chris talked about it today. These are things that have always come up for us. Actually, most of our diseases we share with other species. There are a few that we don't seem to, like smallpox. That was a good thing for us because we were able to eradicate it, but you'll notice that's the only one we've eradicated globally. Those of us in this room probably haven't had polio, but that's still around, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So diseases are something that are a part of the world. And actually, I'm a parasitologist, I study parasites. And one thing we like to say in wildlife parasitology is healthy ecosystems have healthy parasites, have healthy diseases. It's a part of nature. And it turns out we're a part of nature too. It's too bad for us, right? But we're a part of it too. And so my concern with that battle language, that winning or losing language, is that allows us to forget that other stuff. And it allows us to kind of play God. But I think it probably has impacts on how we feel too, to be told that we're under siege. And that's why I'm curious about what Leanne has to say. Maybe she doesn't have, I don't know, I'm putting you on the spot.
I hope this connects clearly. What was going on in my head while in that question and what you were just mentioning, Rachel. We talk a lot about resilience, especially in the face of this pandemic, and how humans can be resilient. And one thing that we talked about in the course was moving beyond resilience and thinking about post-traumatic growth, which is something different. Resilience is kind of being able to stand up to something coming in and impacting you and to be able to resist that. But post-traumatic growth is when you acknowledge that something's been broken or lost and you're able to rebuild that in a new way. And that's exactly what Rod was talking about tonight, that we see these broken things in our system, and instead of just trying to get back to normal, then we really have a good look at what do we want to leave behind and what do we want to bring forward, whether it's on a personal level or on a societal level, in our family level, in our food systems level, all those different ways. So that's what I was thinking about. Maybe I'll throw it over to Rod if you want to add to that.
I agree with that which has been said all of the time. When Rachel talked about always seeing, nature as the problem, we continue to push nature into a corner, and then we're surprised when it fights back. And rather than trying to reinterpret how we can live well alongside of that which we call nature. And I think that's a fundamental challenge for us. We don't want to give up much, we want to get. And it's kind of on our terms, as you said. And I think that's a non-productive position to begin with.
I think this is somehow connected to my big pet peeve of the moment, which is the word unprecedented, right? I mean, how many times haven't you heard someone say, we are living in an unprecedented time or something like this? This is so unprecedented, right? And Rachel reminds us that this is not. Now, with respect to something like the Martyr's Mirror, they didn't have a corner on pandemic patterns, right? I mean, they're in every text because pandemic experience are pretty prevalent. I was talking with the history of philosophy class this morning about the Peloponnesian War, a significant moment of which was a plague that struck when the people of Athens locked themselves inside the walls and tried to defeat Sparta through their naval might, right? That everything was going well until a plague hits Athens, military leader dies, there's a political vacuum, the oligarchs take over, things go to hell, and this is what gives us Socrates, right? I mean, we almost didn't, if we wouldn't have that plague, we might not have had Socrates, right? I mean, so these pandemic traces are scattered throughout human history because we have been living with them for millennia. Sometimes more successfully than others, right? Which is why I want to take a bit of a backwards-looking gaze here in part as well. Don't say unprecedented.
So just to fulfill what I had said I would do here for Chris, to talk about these microscopic refugees from those lost habitats and disappearing species. And David Waltner Taves, Rachel mentioned that he joined us as well by Zoom, and it was a real treat to watch him and Rachel together in the same space. He says the following to your question, Isaac. After millennia of war on the agents of disease and the eradication of some of the worst, we might even find ways of negotiating with them, of accommodating each other's needs, engaging in minor, stylized skirmishes with a reasonable, acceptable death toll on each side. In the 21st century, we are discovering that we will have a common future or none at all. But such a future will require us to educate ourselves in different, more ecologically aware ways. One of our many tasks is to translate that education into a new version of common sense, a kind of solidarity with other people and other species.
Hello, my name is Katrina, but we've all met before. I just wanted to start off by saying that it was such a cool experience to have community within your discipline has learned from this fight with the pandemic. And do you think that it is a lesson that'll stick with us when COVID is quote unquote over? Thank you.
Thanks, Katrina. Let me try. I had the task of weaving this together, and I also had the chance to participate a little bit in terms of what we were seeing in terms of food and agriculture. And I think one of the things that I'm interested to watch, folks that are looking at food system sustainability, ecological implications of our diets, et cetera, were the questions emerging from migrant workers here in Canada. So this is a socially marginalized group of folks that come in every year in order to pick the carrots, the cilantro, wrap it up, and get it onto trucks so that we can eat it. What was striking to me was the change in the way that we spoke about the seasonal worker program here in Canada, and who spoke about it differently. That farmers began to speak about those seasonal workers not as just affordable labor because no other Canadians want to do it, that's also true, but as extremely knowledgeable. I heard one farmer in Southern Ontario talking about these folks come with 20 years of experience, farm workers from Jamaica, from the Caribbean, from Central America. They come with 20 years of experience. There's no way to replace their value in our food system. And yet, the questions of living conditions, of health care for those workers, and of the question of why aren't Canadians interested in the work? Those are things that remain in my imagination as I work on food system related questions. But there may be others here that want to take a crack.
It's not only scientists, biologists who are having their moment right now. Another group is plague historians, right? And I've really enjoyed reading a lot of, they've always been there, right? There's always been plague historians, but most of us have never read them, right? And there's some really interesting stuff out there, which, you know, and when we were reading Boccaccio, I mean, the opening of that text, you know, talks about how this is in the middle of the Black Death, right? You thought this pandemic was bad. We're talking about like 50, maybe 75 million people in Europe, which is basically the population that they were counting. That's a lot of people, right? What happens, what's the situation that Boccaccio describes in the prologue, right? Some people deal with this by running out to the taverns and drinking all night. Others lock themselves in their rooms and never come outside, right? Sound familiar? Nothing's unprecedented here, right? I mean, the only thing that's unprecedented, I think, is the depth of our amnesia. And paying attention, which is what Kenton opened with, right? To what's in front of us, yes, but also what we've lived through for many, many years can go a long way to helping us know how to live on here. Of course, the people in Decameron, they got together in a cohort, right? What was it, Danica, do you remember? Katrina? There's like 7 women, 3 men. Kind of, think about it, it's kind of the demographics of the contemporary university, right? 7 women to every 3 men. And they got together and they told stories. They had a lot of sex too, but, right? I mean, it was a kind of a cohort move, right? Which is the thing that we're hearing about now, right? Our education bureaucrats didn't discover this.
How many peer review, which I think my colleagues here know what that is, but I think for the general public, this is the first time that they've heard about peer review, which is it's a foundational piece in any research endeavor. If your work, if your methods and your analysis and your interpretation of your data doesn't stand up to your peers' examination, it's not good. It's not good work. And so we're finding that these unsung heroes of science, right? The peer reviewers, we don't get paid for this. We don't have time in our schedules for this, but we do it. I think my colleagues probably do as well. I do it because we want our work peer reviewed. And we're part of a community of peers who are trying to do good research, and we can't do that alone, right? Our own one little mag light in the dark isn't going to answer our questions. So that's something that I think, while that system is being stressed right now because we're all overburdened with other things, with family, with other kinds of work. The editorial was talking about how, thinking about colleagues in more resource-poor contexts who are researcher clinicians. They're busy being clinicians, they're busy being doctors right now. They don't have time to do this other work. So there's this stress on that system, but at the same time, we've seen this huge speed up in the system as well. We've agreed as a scientific community, we want to know more about COVID. It's really important to all of us. And so there's this great global effort to have that research in particular pushed through good peer review and quickly. And the other thing we're finding, I'm seeing this in all the journals that I publish in, that all the work about COVID is suddenly out from behind a paywall. It's suddenly open access for everyone, and that was a really heartwarming thing to see when that first started. So I can read all of this literature that's coming out, and I can send it to my students when otherwise I probably wouldn't have been able to. This stuff, I don't know the economics of it, but it's heartwarming to see how scientists are trying to serve the public for real. Yeah.
Can I just follow on that quickly before you put your mask on?
Sure.
We were talking earlier, you're teaching a global health course this term.
Mm-hmm.
What are places that people who are serious about looking for information on the pandemic and where we stand and what's happening right now, where should they be looking?
Wikipedia. I'm just kidding. That was a joke. That was a joke. Yeah, there's lots and lots of really good research out there, and lots of people doing really good public health. Like, I listened to our public health officers. I was in BC in the summer, and we're listening to the radio. We're listening to Bonnie Henry's, daily daily update, and I just heard the most beautiful description of error bars on a graph.
Of what?
Error bars. Error bars on a
Error
graph.
bars.
Yeah, what does this mean? What are error bars? And she just had this wonderful way of explaining to a lay audience, what does this data figure actually mean? So we have wonderful people doing this work for us. So I would start there, actually. But there are lots of good resources. If you want to read more deeply, look for peer-reviewed. So peer-reviewed means scientific journals where researchers are doing independent research, and there's a process. So like The Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine and all of these big ones, that it's all free right now. You just have to look. And, non-governmental organizations, WHO, has great public health information about this stuff. So there are people whose whole job it is to communicate health research to non-scientist audiences. So look for those voices.
Thank you. Rod, I'm waiting for questions, and so I'm going to ask one of my own, unless I see someone stand up quickly. David Waltner Taves talks about the need for narrative therapy at this point. He talks about it as an ecologist and as a veterinarian. You're talking about it as a sociologist. You brought up stories and the possibility of the stories that we tell ourselves. Can you say a bit more about that and the kinds of story making and storytelling that sociologists are doing, that they're looking at as we try and make sense of the pandemic? Or just say a little bit more about what you meant about the opportunity to tell stories now and the kinds of stories that we might tell.
I think Chris touched upon this, that all the stories that we tell ourselves about the world that exists out there are not true. The stories that we tell may be helpful in interpreting, making sense of it, but that doesn't mean that they're actually true renditions of it. And I think as it relates to the pandemic, critical sociologists are trying to say, as I was trying to suggest, are our stories helpful in guiding us through this time? Are we just going to go back to the status quo and redo the same type of mistakes? But back to normal, rather than actually taking the time to reflect on the lessons that can be learned. And my fear is that we will just return largely to the status quo. And that's where I think the class was trying to head, was to opening up doors to considering new opportunities, to getting us all to think in different ways by engaging each other across disciplines. Because of the vocabulary and the way that we look at things in our respective disciplines, sometimes we're blind to options, and these discussions between people like you have up the front here are rich, and I think that we should have more of them. I don't know if that helps.
That's helpful for sure. Leanne, it seems to me like you must be working all the time in a moment like this. Never mind adapting to the teaching which Rod so beautifully narrated in the context of Zoom teaching. We're grateful for all the students who are here, either in Zoom or in person, but the platform's tiring, I think. What are you finding as a practitioner? What advice do you have? It's very helpful understanding. I've thought often this summer about the limbic part of the brain, all of that stuff that you did and what that generates. What kinds of advice do you find giving people, or that you're giving people, to your clients, to your students? Anxiety rates are up significantly. What are some practical things? It's like the washing of hands that the public health people tell us. What are some things that you're sharing with folks?
Sure, great question. I think it's particularly hard right now. Well, this whole thing's been hard, but at the start of the pandemic, we had this adrenaline going on. Things were starting, we were like, okay, we're doing this, we're all in this together, and you had this energy to kind of do lockdown, and it was exciting, and that kind of got you through the first hump. And now we're 6 months in, and people are really tired. It's exhausting. Our resources are depleted. Someone was saying to me, it felt in spring we just had to get through the next 6 weeks or the next 8 weeks and it'd be fine. And now we're looking at, okay, we need to get through the next 10 months of this, maybe, maybe even longer. So we're just depleted. So my biggest advice for people right now, or what I'm talking a lot about, is self-compassion and self-care, especially self-compassion, which is just being patient with yourself, taking really good care of yourself. Not expecting yourself to be high-performing. As I said earlier, we're in this state of dysregulation, and we need to take the time to really take care of ourselves on a good level. So things to do, some of the things I mentioned around music, regulate yourself, listen to the music that you enjoy, spend time in nature, eat well, sleep, stay connected with the people that you care about. These are all really simple things, but things we can just forget about when we get overwhelmed. So those are the things I try to keep bringing clients back to and bringing myself back to. I know I call it COVID brain, that my brain just is not working in the right way. I've lost my phone 5 times in the last week. One time it was on top of my fridge. I don't know why. But to be kind with yourself around those types of things, and no, you're just not firing at your peak level, and that's okay. To be kind to yourself and treat yourself with the same compassion you would treat the people around you.
Thanks, Leanne. Rod, sorry, go ahead. Chris.
I want to put in a little plug for Zoom.
Oh, good.
And I'm as tired of it as anybody. But I miss faces. I miss human faces. Human faces are beautiful. Human faces are goofy. And as much as I love teaching people on campus here, I don't get to see your faces right now. And I remember teaching the course in summer, which was all on Zoom, and the students were kind of spread across the country, but we got to look at each other's faces. I mean, we all thought the eyes were really important for expression, and they are, but the mouth and the nose and the cheeks and the jowls and all the stupid things we do with our faces to communicate, I miss that. And there's an interesting way in which Zoom, artificial as it is, mediates that, and so almost is more in person than teaching in a room full of masked up people. I'm not trying to stir up trouble, but I like faces.
Thanks, Chris. This might be the right follow-up for Rod then, and it comes from online, but it builds on this Zoom platform. This is from Claudia Duick. I'm curious if you can speak to the involvement of technology as a form of communication and surveillance during this pandemic. This is something that perhaps is unprecedented, smiley face. I think that's for you, Chris. Should we be wary of its effect on our notion of how we relate to others and how we participate in society? So a springboard on technology, following up on Chris and Zoom.
Well, first of all, I think Chris's comments are well taken. It's kind of a love-hate relationship with the platform. You know, part of it I agree. In being able to see people's faces, there's something that feels tangible there that I miss when I can only see the mask. I guess I worry a bit about, you know, should this continue in a protracted time? In other words, if we're into this pandemic, you know, for quite a long haul, whether we're going to start to exchange or to learn habits of not engaging, right? Or bypassing direct engagement with people. And I believe that there's enough strong empirical data out there there's, our own lived experience to say that something different happens when we're in proximity with each other. We need each other. And so I think to ask ourselves, what are we doing with technology, and is technology, somehow kind of driving a wedge down the middle? I don't know if that addresses the question, but.
We can find out from Claudia when we see her again. Last question here, I think, as we're closing in on 8:30. Again, from online. This is from a Workington. I wonder if it's a Workington that we know. I'm interested in more personal responses from the panelists, if they are willing. With your research reflections, what you've noticed and learned during the pandemic, are there long-term changes that you personally intend to make in your lifestyles, as far as living more sustainably with your ecological environment, changing how you live with family and social circles, etc.? That is Danica's mom. Hi, Danica's mom. We're all shy now. We've got a student's parent here.
It's like when you're teaching and you ask a question, you wait long enough, someone will answer.
15 seconds, that's all you need.
I thought it was 10, but okay. That's a wonderful question. That's something that I've been thinking about. And in the spring, I was thinking of it as souvenirs. You go somewhere foreign and you bring home a souvenir. That's kind of how I've been thinking about it. And I have kind of goofy souvenirs. I did learn how to bake sourdough, and it's really good. My sourdough is really good. I have a whole cookbook, and at the top of every page I've printed out, I've written COVID cooking 2020. Gonna make
Stories.
it's a deal. And I think we all have these things. And I think for myself, it's been part of what has brought a little bit of sparkle back sometimes. Because you can get bogged down. So I don't know that that's really gets to I should do that again. So that's kind of how I've been thinking about it.
Thanks, Rachel. We got time for one more comment, I think.
I suppose this is personal. Maybe I just lead a kind of boring life. But, there's something about the moment that makes us all sort of think about what matters most, right? And so I'm thinking here at CMU. The fact that we are together as faculty and students, right, doing the work we do, weird as it may be, right, is beautiful, and that matters, and we want to keep it going as long as we can in the most fruitful sort of way. Yeah, we can all go online if we need to, but we don't want to do that, right? And so, I miss all the people in the audience, but that's a sacrifice that we're having to make right now so that we can do what matters most, and I really cherish that.
That's a good, sorry, go ahead, Rod. Your last word here.
I don't know, a couple of things that stand out for me is the opportunities that exist at my doorstep that I haven't taken advantage of because there's things that have drawn my attention further afield. In other words, the lakes that we canoed on, right, this summer, or the places that we took advantage of going to visit that I've not been to in this area, that which is in proximity to me. Another one is realizing that, as Kenton, you kind of alluded to, that there are elements within our food system that are fundamentally unjust, and that we are often underpaying farmers, and as a result, even treating migrant workers even worse because they're further. And and trying to think of ways in my own consumptive habits that I can address that I can, establish relationships where I'm buying from people, again, in proximity to me, people that I know, their names, and people that I care about deeply.
Oh, I'm going to jump into this question too, quickly before we end. I think for me, what I was thinking about personally a lot was how I have a tendency in my life to think towards bigger events, like get through this semester to get to the summer, or get through this to get to, we'll be rewarded with this concert that's coming up, or Folk Fest that's coming up, and be really future focused. And then everything was gone. There was nothing, all our trips were canceled, Folk Fest was canceled, there was nothing out there to look forward to. And it made me really think about my day-to-day life and what meaning is happening in every day, and how do I want to spend these precious moments every single day. And I think that resonated with some of the other things, but that's what I'm taking going forward.
Thanks to you all, good colleagues, friends, and folks that are ready to jump in. We are at time, and I want to say thank you to all of those folks that have joined us online. It's a strange, disembodied experience. I hope it was okay. I saw some of your questions, and if I didn't get to them all, my apologies. And to our students who are here, you have no idea how lovely it is to see faces and have someone to look at rather than just Daryl or Kevin in the back on technology. So thanks for coming. It's lovely to have all of you here in person, and those of you that are here at a distance. We really appreciate you taking time. Good night.